Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are in day 28 of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and we got a lot to cover today. And first and foremost, I wanted to report on an interesting development that is starting to appear in some media outlets that would indicate that the defense minister of the Russian Federation, Shoigu, quite possibly has gone missing. And allegedly, we don't know their circumstances behind him going missing. Some reports indicate it could be for health concerns. Other reports indicate it could be for quite possibly the performance of his duties in the ongoing conflict. In fact, quite possibly, well, I don't want to say quite possibly, rumor is that he could be under some sort of a house arrest. But again, we don't know this. Again, this is early information coming out that, again, Shoigu has not made an appearance in some time. And again, it could revolve around health difficulties or the possibility of an actual some sort of house arrest. Now, in other news, we continue to hear about the high casualty rates being reported by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and now even NATO is also reporting, along with the U.S. Defense Department, that they also believe the Russian Federation is absorbing very, very significant losses. And we continue to hear about that 7 to 15,000 range, 7 to 10,000 range of possible Russian KIA. And they're using a traditional formula in which you would have to take into account the amount of battlefield fatalities, or KIA'd, and then multiply that by 3 to determine a usual number of wounded soldiers. And in this case, again, the reports coming out of NATO, obviously some of those reports are being influenced by Ukrainian state media and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, attempting to articulate that Russia may have suffered 7 to 10,000, again, battlefield KIA, possibly up towards 14 to 15 range, and then another 30 to 40,000 battlefield wounded. That is a very, very hard number to believe on the surface. Again, that is just incredible numbers in terms of the length of the conflict. Again, we're under 30 days, and we're probably looking at Yom Kippur, 1973 Arab-Israeli War, in terms of Arab losses during that conflict, if you want to kind of compare and contrast those with the Russian casualties. And that conflict, I believe, just lasted a little over 2 weeks. But again, these numbers are really kind of difficult to get your head around. Now, if you're going to accept those numbers in terms of Russian casualty estimates by the West, by NATO, by the United States, by even Ukrainian sources, you also have to estimate that Ukrainian losses are probably very similar. And the reason I say that is obviously the two forces are engaged in some very, very serious ground combat. Is it possible that the Russians, being on the offensive, are receiving more casualties than the Ukrainians who are on the defensive? That's a possibility. Now, at the same time, we do know the Ukrainians are also counterattacking as well, which could lead to a higher number of casualties by the Ukrainian forces. And we're seeing some of those counterattacks taking place within the vicinity of Kiev and obviously Mykolaiv. And I wanted to talk more about Mykolaiv and kind of some more information coming out of that area as well. But what another area of interest that has to be added into this equation is just not the ground combat. You have to take into account Russian air sorties. Now, right now, it's being reported that quite possibly the Russians are doing about 200 air sorties per day. Now, we don't know if that includes all tactical aircraft or just fixed-wing tactical aircraft. Does that include actual helicopter attacks as well? Just to compare and contrast, the United States during operations against Yugoslavia and during the First and Second Gulf War, the United States was launching upwards to 1,000 sorties per day in some of those campaigns. Now, back to the actual war between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, those Russian airstrikes, those 200 sorties a day, are causing quite possibly some very heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. And again, that's where you kind of have to say, okay, well, how close is the Russian number to KIA wounded to the Ukrainians? Because obviously the Ukrainians are not conducting the types of tactical aircraft operations in terms of airstrikes against the Russians as the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. And inherently, a couple of airstrikes, a couple of cruise missiles and very large ordnance dropped on a barracks facility or a grouping of troops is inherently going to cause significantly more casualties than a certain engagement on the ground. So again, that's why I'm basically trying to explain that again. I don't think these two casualty estimates are probably too far off from each other in terms of both Russia and Ukraine. Compounding that, we've also received reports from journalists who have made their way into morgues inside of Mykolaiv. Now, normally per day inside of the city of Mykolaiv, usually there was roughly 20 persons in the morgue, or the morgue would receive per day. Right now, the morgue is receiving up to 100, on average, 100 per day. And a lot of these casualties, these dead that the Ukrainian morgues are receiving in Mykolaiv, many of these individuals are wearing battle fatigues, meaning they are uniformed Ukrainian service members. And in one account has a reporter going into one of these morgues and seeing hundreds of fatigued, clothed individuals in the morgue dead. And obviously that would indicate a very, very high casualty rate for the Ukrainian military inside the Mykolaiv area of operations. And we also know that obviously the Russians have launched numerous tactical air operations against targets in Mykolaiv, to include cruise missile and Iskander attacks that has resulted in significant casualties for the Ukrainians. Now, what you also have to consider is the bodies that you're just not going to get to the morgue as well. So if they're seeing the morgues overflowing with Ukrainian battlefield casualties in terms of Ukrainian service members, you also have to account for the bodies that they're simply not going to receive, that are buried in rubble or have just been obliterated by some of these large ordinances. So again, as we look at the Russian casualties in the West, the Western media talks about the significant Russian casualties. Again, you're probably looking at equal casualties, unfortunately, for the Ukrainians as well. And again, it is going, after this is all said and done, and probably a year after this is all said and done, there will be obviously very, very detailed analysis of this conflict. And I think once we get to that point, we are going to indeed see that the Ukrainians indeed probably took just as many casualties as the Russian Federation. Maybe not. Maybe the Russians are getting the worst end of the deal in terms of actual ground combat, meaning tank versus tank, or better yet, probably more likely, anti-tank guided weapon systems versus convoys, Russian convoys. But with that being said, again, the Ukrainians are getting the worst end of the stick in terms of tactical aircraft and heavy artillery hitting convoys and hitting fixed locations where the Ukrainian military is operating from. And again, a lot of this is state secrets for the Ukrainians, and they are not announcing their battlefield casualties. They are only giving guesstimates of Russian battlefield casualties. And again, it would appear that both Western media and the Pentagon is taking some of those estimates at heart and reporting some of those estimates as well. Maybe not as much, but they're giving the Ukrainians the benefit of the doubt in terms of kind of giving a guesstimate within 50% of some of the higher end estimates for the Ukrainian reports. So I hope that makes sense. We continue to hear about the equipment and weapons coming into the Ukraine conflict zone from the West. There is an active supply line now with vast amounts of not just weapon systems, but other systems needed for warfare that you would use in terms of supply, fuel, trucks, a host of body armor, helmets, uniforms, personal weapons, ammunition, a vast array of weapons and supply are being now supplied to the Ukrainians by the West to continue this war effort. But again, the most important element that the Ukrainians are receiving is intelligence, signals intelligence, actual satellite intel centered on the movement of Russian forces and where those forces are heading and building up, targeting locations on where the Russians are building up, where some of their staging areas are, so the Ukrainians can then launch attacks with both Turkish-made drones and long-range artillery assets as well. So again, a lot of assistance is being sent to the Ukrainians, and again, the most important assistance that the Ukrainians are receiving, again, is that intelligence. Intelligence can win wars, and when you actively know what your enemy is planning and what they're doing and where they're deploying and how you can counter that, that is what is happening on the ground for the Ukrainians right now. And quite possibly, there's periods of time where the Ukrainians are probably getting better intelligence and having better situational awareness at times than the actual Russians have. So that has to be taken into account, and obviously is a huge concern for the Russian military at this point. We continue to see very heavy fighting taking place in Mariupol, outside of Mykolaiv. It seems that there has been some setbacks for the Russian military within the vicinity of Mykolaiv. There are some reports indicating that, in fact, Russian artillery can no longer hit Mykolaiv in terms of self-propelled guns, i.e. 152 millimeter, 122 millimeter tubes, but long-range rocket fire can still engage and attack Mykolaiv in terms of some of those assets that the Russians are deploying, some of those bigger rocket systems in the range of 300 millimeter and beyond, and then obviously the Iskanders can hit really anything in the Ukrainian battle space, and they continue to use those assets as well. But again, like I have talked about yesterday and the day before, we're really seeing the Russians attempting to reduce and or rubbleize a lot of these areas where the Ukrainians are holding out, in areas in the suburbs of Kiev, maybe not so much as we're seeing now in Kharkiv, in areas in Severodonetsk, areas such as Mykolaiv, maybe not so much as Mykolaiv now. But definitely, obviously, again, Mariupol, continuing to see Russian operations in Mariupol, just leveling that city. And again, we're still probably looking for at least a few days, upwards to a few weeks, before the Ukrainian forces in that city capitulate. The Ukrainians still have main battle tanks operating in Mariupol as well. That's a significant sign that they still have ammunition for those tanks. They have not been all eliminated, and they're still fighting in urban built-up areas with the main battle tanks, the Ukrainians. So they have to be hiding those tanks at some point, out of threat from Russian aircraft and obviously other systems that could go after those tanks. So in all likelihood, they're hiding those tanks in all probability civilian buildings and pulling them in and keeping them out of surveillance activity from the Russians, and then pulling them out and then having them engage the Russian military. But it's a significant fight right now, especially in Mariupol and some of these other areas, as it continues. But again, we're starting to hear more and more about some limited operations by the Ukrainians in terms of counterattacks. Again, near Kiev, near Mykolaiv and Kherson. And again, the Ukrainians are taking casualties in these operations. The Ukrainians are learning that offensive operations against an enemy force can lead to higher casualties. And right now, the Ukrainians are getting a taste of that in some areas in which they are launching some of these counterattacks. But that is news from the battlefield. Obviously, we're watching this very, very closely, and we will have more very, very soon as we continue to watch this incredibly violent and unfortunately bloody conflict that is taking place in the Midwestern, Eastern European area of operations. Hope everybody enjoyed the video, and we'll certainly have more very, very soon. Have a good day.